Singapore is a tiny country, so tiny that you can drive across the island in just about an hour. With a total area of around 733 square kilometer, Singapore is home to a population of around 55 lakh people, that is around 5.5 million people. Despite its small size and lack of natural resources, Singapore's people enjoy one of the highest average incomes in the world, ahead of countries like France, Germany, and Japan. On this video, we'll be discussing the economic success story of Singapore and how did it reach these great heights. Just a quick introduction about myself. I'm Ayushi. I'm an Indian Economic Service Officer and I'm currently working with the Government of India. I have worked at the intersection of economics, finance, and public policy for the last 7 years. On this YouTube channel, I have been making videos around different economic concepts. This video is a case study on Singapore's economic success. I'll be talking about the practical policies which led to the growth of this country. I'll also be discussing my observations from my visit to the country at an official level and as a common tourist. First things first, let's see how rich is Singapore exactly. This is a chart of Singapore's GDP per capita since independence. If you notice, then the GDP per capita has grown over 125 times, and this has led to Singapore becoming one of the high-income nations. Rarely in the history of humanity has a nation traveled the path from poverty to riches so quickly or so thoroughly. So how did this little island get so rich? Let's talk about the 3 P's which define the growth of any nation. These are place, people, and policies. All these 3 P's are interlinked and all are crucial for the growth of any economy. Let's talk about the first P, that is place. Now, Singapore does not have natural resources like coal or oil, but it does have something that countries cannot buy, that is location. The island sits in the middle of an important trade route which connects Asia to Europe through the Strait of Malacca. This is one of the most important shipping routes in the world, and Singapore's location advantage at the critical juncture at the Strait of Malacca has contributed immensely to its growth. This is also a key reason why the British decided back in 1819 to set up a colony in Singapore. However, location is not everything. There are several countries nearby or across the globe, for example, different African cities and African nations that could have made use of their location advantage, but they were not quite as successful. This is because there are several other factors that lead to the growth of any economy. Unlike some of its neighbors, which wanted to separate themselves from their colonial histories, Singapore decided to keep close ties with Britain even after its independence in 1965. This was an important decision because this helped Singapore expand its world footprint and established itself as a major shipping port and a trading hub. This also meant that Singapore could exploit its location advantage to become a leading player in exporting refined petroleum products across the globe. And as I discussed in my previous video on GDP, the higher the exports of a country, the higher is the GDP. Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea came to be known as the 4 Asian tigers, which have grown rapidly since the 1960s. Their rise was fueled by exports, industrialization, and the very critical government intervention. Now let's talk about the next 2 P's, that is, people and policies. Both the P's are extremely critical and both are extremely interlinked. If there are right people for policy implementation, then policies can be highly effective. And highly effective policies can lead to the upliftment of the common people. This is how interlinked these 2 terms are. So I will be discussing both the terms together, and this will give you a better idea about how great nations are formed. Lee Kuan Yew, often called as Singapore's founding father, also served as its prime minister between 1959 to 1990. He laid down the basic principles for good governance, which established the path for Singapore's success. And a lot of Singapore's early success was due to effective government policy and a drive to deliver. First, corruption-free public service. At the very outset, strong punitive measures were set in place to deter and punish corrupt public officials and political leaders. The idea was simple yet powerful, that efficient and transparent processes reduce incentives for corruption. The larger aim was to translate this into effective policy making and policy implementation. This was probably one of the most important pillars of good governance, and on this rested the other reforms that were introduced by the government later on. Second, economic policies. The government attracted foreign investment through tax incentives, growing the economy and easing unemployment, which fell from an estimated 14% in 1959 to 4.5% in the 1970s. By the 1980s, Singapore was a regional manufacturing hub and it was one of the world's biggest producer of electronic items. In 1985, Singapore went into its first post-independence recession, which induced the government to introduce several measures. State-owned companies like telecommunication were privatized to make them more competitive. Then, at the turn of the century, service industries like finance and insurance were further liberalized. This openness helped to grow the share of services from just 24% of the GDP in 1985 to more than 70% in 2017. Multinational companies began to set up regional headquarters in Singapore, and this is the Singapore as we know it today. This attracted even bigger players to Singapore, and hence more corporates started turning to Singapore, and this contributed to the rise of GDP of the country. Now it is ranked as one of the world's easiest places to do business and is praised immensely for transforming itself from a developing country to a developed country in such a short period of time. Third, focus on people. The nation is the top 5 largest recipients of net FDI, foreign direct investment, according to the World Bank. This means that a tiny island of not even 6 million people has higher incoming investment from outside than large countries like India or developed countries like Japan. But the more important point to note here is that how has Singapore deployed this money? In the absence of natural resources, Singapore knew that its greatest assets was its people. Hence, Singapore collaborated with the companies that were investing in Singapore and set up various technical schools to upskill its workforce in areas such as IT, electronics, and petrochemicals. This strategy was a huge part of how Singapore was able to transition from low-skilled exports of textiles in the 1970s to things like biotech, semiconductors, and aerospace engineering by the 1990s. The Singapore Workforce Skills Qualification (WSQ) is a national credential system for imparting and enhancing the skills and competencies of the workforce. These training programs are based on the in-demand skills and competencies and are validated by employers, unions, and professional bodies. As a result, Singapore frequently ranks top for international standardized testing and has one of the highest human capital index in the world. Finally, Singapore rewards meritocracy, whether in private sphere or public sphere. The incentives, rewards, and compensations are based on merit, and this fosters a culture of competition and growth within the country. Fourth, multiculturalism. The country not only focused on the economic upliftment of its citizens, but also social upliftment and promoting ethnic integrity and racial harmony among its population. Labor strikes were common on the island in the 1960s, even with high unemployment. On top of that, there was a housing crisis, with Singapore being home to one of the largest slum settlements in the world. So, what did the government do in this situation? Well, the government decided to give the people something that they would work for, like a house of their own. This is why one of the first Singaporean government agencies was set up, focused on building affordable public housing. While just 9% of the population lived in these public housing in the 1960s, this figure currently stands at more than 80%. In fact, the Housing Development Board has an ethnic integration policy, which means that the houses are allotted in a way that there is a balanced mix of various ethnic communities in these townships. Fifth, long-term vision for itself and its citizens. Let me give you a few examples here. Singapore at the time of its independence was dependent on its neighboring countries, in particular Malaysia, for water. However, keeping a long-term vision in mind, it worked on expanding the water reservoirs, operationalizing desalination plants to convert the sea water into usable water, and created new reservoirs to pave its path to water self-sufficiency. One of my experiences was that during an official tour of the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Singapore, we saw the long term urbanization plan the country had mapped for itself. Not for the next 5, 10, or 20 years, but for the next 50 years. This shows the long term vision of the country on themes such as livable and inclusive communities, sustainability, climate change, and economic development. In terms of the focus on its citizens, the citizens have to mandatorily pay at least 20% of their monthly wages into the Central Provident Fund, a savings fund. These savings can then be used for particular items such as pension, housing, medical expenses, or university education. This is aimed at long term wealth creation for the citizens and also explains why the nation has one of the highest saving rates in the world. So far, I have focused on the positive aspects of the country, but there are certain areas of concern as well. For instance, the high cost of living and inequality. For 5 years in a row, Singapore has been named one of the world's most expensive cities to live in, ahead of cities like New York and London. That is largely because of the high taxes on cars, making Singapore the most expensive place in the world to buy and run an automobile. It is also the third most expensive place on earth to buy clothes. While Singapore is rich in terms of GDP per capita, the median monthly salary is $3,270. As I mentioned, about 20% of this goes into a mandatory savings account. While this has its own long term benefits, it does restrict the purchasing power of the population. Just a quick fun fact, if you have watched the movie Crazy Rich Asians, which was set in Singapore, it showed the lifestyle of rich Singaporeans. But it also has a very high inequality. And the government has called the issue of inequality as a national priority. It has to be seen whether this issue can be tackled effectively or not. Having said that, the growth story of Singapore is truly remarkable and a success story in the modern world. With this, I conclude today's video on Singapore's economic success story. I hope you like this video. Tell me in the comments what other factors in your opinion contributed to the growth of Singapore. If you like this video, then do press the like button and subscribe to the channel. I will be posting more such case studies around different countries and their growth stories. I will see you on the next video. Till then, take care, stay safe, bye.